August 6, 1943. Close to midnight in the Solomon Islands. The sea around Vela Gulf was a sheet of dark glass, broken only by 4 narrow wakes knifing through the water at high speed. At the head of the column, the Japanese destroyer Shiga cut the way forward, its bow lifting slightly as it rode over low swells. On the bridge, under the dim red glow of covered lamps, a young destroyer captain stood with his hands resting lightly on the railing. Commander Takaro Tsuji had seen many nights like this. He lifted his binoculars and looked ahead into the featureless darkness. There was no moon, only a faint band of stars overhead and the occasional spark of phosphorescence as the hull sliced through the water. The other 3 destroyers, Hagakase, Arashi, and Kawakaze, held their stations behind him, for shadows moving as one unit. In the compartments below, more than 900 troops were packed with their equipment, heading toward the island of Kolombangra. Crates of ammunition, food, fuel drums, and supplies filled every spare space. This run was one of many. The Japanese called these high-speed missions special transport. The Americans gave them another name, the Tokyo Express. For months, the pattern had been familiar. Japanese destroyers slipped out of their bases after sunset, raced down the channel the sailors called the slot, unloaded troops and cargo at remote jungle coves, then turned and sprinted home before daylight brought American aircraft. Night after night, the same rhythm. It was dangerous work, but it was also the kind of operation the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it did better than anyone else on Earth. Takaro believed it too. At 34, he had spent most of his adult life on ships like this one. He had stood on destroyer bridges in heavy rain, in tropical heat, in seas filled with drifting wreckage. He knew by habit how far his lookouts could see on a night like this, in good conditions, a few kilometers by eye. He knew the outlines of American warships at night as well as he knew the shape of his own ship. Tonight felt no different at first. The engines throbbed steadily beneath his feet. The air carried the familiar smell of oil and salt. Somewhere astern, signal lamps blinked briefly as the column confirmed its course. Takaro changed the angle of his binoculars a few degrees, searching for any hint of enemy presence. There was nothing, only darkness. Yet the mission he led would be remembered not for its routine, but for how quickly that sense of routine vanished. Takaro Tsuji had not arrived at this moment by chance. He had entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy as a teenager, chosen from thousands who tried for a place. The academy at Edojima was an austere world of discipline and repetition. Cadets spent long hours in classrooms studying navigation, gunnery, engineering, and fleet tactics. They marched, drilled, and stood long watches. For Takaro, the sea was not just a profession, it was the environment in which his entire adult life unfolded. Graduating near the top of his class, he joined the destroyer force, small, fast ships that demanded quick thinking and calm under pressure. Destroyer captains had to make decisions in seconds, often with incomplete information, frequently at night. That suited him. He was not the kind of officer who enjoyed planning from an office. He wanted to be where orders turned into action. Through the early years of the Pacific War, he served in multiple operations, escorting convoys, screening larger ships, and participating in battles that flashed briefly across the map before vanishing into history. At the Battle of the Java Sea, he had watched Allied forces break apart under coordinated Japanese torpedo attacks. Off Guadalcanal, he had seen the glow of burning fuel on water after night bombardments of the airfield Allied forces had carved from jungle and coral. Those engagements reinforced what he had been taught, that Japanese night fighting skills were exceptional. From the 1930s onward, the Navy had invested enormous effort in training officers and crews for combat in darkness. Young officers like Takaro spent months practicing target recognition at night, learning to judge distance and bearing from faint silhouettes and subtle differences in haze. They memorized the shapes of foreign ships from handbooks and models. In exercises, they set up firing solutions using only optical data and mental calculations. On destroyers, this training went even further. Crews learned to perform complicated maneuvers without radio chatter, maintaining formation by watching the faint glow of the ship ahead. Signalmen communicated with shaded lamps and hand signals. Torpedo crews drilled on launching weapons accurately based on estimates shouted from the bridge. Everything was designed to make these ships effective hunters in the dark. By 1942, the results were plain. In the waters around Guadalcanal, Japanese destroyers had consistently outperformed their American counterparts at night. They struck swiftly, launched long-range torpedoes that reached out farther than the Americans expected, and disappeared into darkness again. For officers like Takaro, those records were not just numbers. They were proof that years of effort had produced a real advantage. Now, in 1943, he stood on his own bridge, leading his own column, drawing on that experience. He had taken part in many Tokyo Express runs already, some more eventful than others. There had been times when American ships appeared suddenly on the horizon, times when the sea was lit by flares and star shells, times when his own ship's guns had spoken. Yet each time, he had brought his ship and his crew back home. Tonight's mission order looked to him like one more page in a thick book. Far from the bridge of Shiga, in offices lined with maps and charts, other officers had been thinking about the same stretch of water. The Solomon Islands campaign had begun with American landings on Guadalcanal the year before. That jungle-covered island, whose name had meant little to ordinary people before the war, suddenly became a key point in the entire Pacific. Control of that island and its nearby sea lanes shaped the routes between the United States, Australia, and the broader Pacific theater. Japan, determined to hold its positions, needed to move troops and supplies through a long chain of islands and narrow channels. During daylight, Allied aircraft from land bases and carriers could patrol those waters. Any Japanese ship venturing into open areas under the sun risked prompt detection and attack. Trying to run convoys slowly by day would have been an invitation to disaster. Night, therefore, offered the only realistic solution. The concept behind the Tokyo Express was simple in outline but demanding in execution. Send destroyers racing down the slot after dusk, unload as quickly as possible at prearranged drop points, and then accelerate back home before first light. Because destroyers were faster than typical cargo ships and better armed, they had a chance of slipping past Allied forces under cover of darkness. The term express, originally coined in a mocking tone by Americans, gradually became a grudging acknowledgement of how regularly these missions succeeded. In the first year of this campaign, Japanese destroyers completed dozens of such runs. Some nights were quiet, with only the sound of anchors dropping and landing craft scraping along coral. Other nights saw sudden flares, brief exchanges of gunfire, and hurried maneuvers. But overall, the pattern favored Japan. Reinforcements reached isolated garrisons. Food and ammunition that might otherwise have been impossible to deliver made it through. Reports compiled by staff officers in Rabaul and other bases painted a picture of consistent performance. Night battles, when they occurred, often ended with Japanese ships inflicting heavier losses than they took. American commanders grew wary of entering narrow waters after sunset, especially when intelligence suggested that Japanese destroyers might be on the move. From the Japanese perspective, the numbers told an encouraging story. Their destroyers had shown they could operate under difficult conditions and come out ahead. The message that filtered down the chain of command was clear: the night belonged to them. Takaro absorbed that message not as propaganda, but as an extension of what he saw from his own bridge. When he gave commands during night operations, he did so confident that his crew understood what to do, that their training matched the demands of the environment, and that their equipment, though not perfect, was sufficient to give them an edge. What he could not yet see was that, far away in American shipyards and laboratories, a different answer to the problem of night had been in the making. In the months leading up to that August night, the American approach to night combat had changed significantly. Early in the war, American ships in the Pacific had been surprised more than once by Japanese units appearing unexpectedly in darkness. Traditional methods of detection, lookouts with binoculars, occasional star shells, basic long-wavelength radar sets, had not been enough to match Japanese proficiency at optical spotting. Several costly encounters had driven home the same point. Relying solely on human vision at night meant conceding an important advantage to an opponent who had spent years perfecting that specific skill. To close that gap, Allied forces turned increasingly to technology. Radar, used on larger ships since the early war years, began to be refined and miniaturized. Engineers developed sets that operated on shorter wavelengths, improving resolution and allowing smaller antennas and equipment to be installed. One such device, the SG Surface Search Radar, represented a significant step forward. Compact enough to be fitted onto destroyers, it could detect ships at considerable distances, even in darkness or poor weather. For the crews using it, SG radar changed the way the sea looked, literally. Instead of staring into empty night hoping to catch a glimpse of a distant silhouette, operators could watch a circular display where small points of light marked the positions of objects around them. Range and bearing could be read directly. Movement over time revealed an opponent's course and speed. This did not remove the need for seamanship or tactical judgment. Officers still had to decide how to maneuver, where to place their own ships, and when to engage. but the information feeding those decisions was dramatically improved. In training sessions held at bases across the Pacific, American destroyer crews learned how to interpret these new screens. Young sailors who had never been to sea before the war sat in dim, air-conditioned rooms practicing on radar simulators. They learned to recognize patterns. A single large echo moving steadily might be a cruiser. A group of smaller ones traveling in formation could be a column of destroyers. They drilled in determining courses, estimating time to contact, and coordinating with gun and torpedo crews. By the time Takaro led his column into Vela Gulf, the American destroyer forces he would encounter were no longer relying primarily on the unaided eye. Their lookouts still watched the night, but on their bridges, in small radar spaces below, other sailors studied glowing screens that turned the dark surface of the sea into something approaching a diagram. Takaro did not yet know the specifics. He had heard general reports that the Allies were improving their radar. His own ship carried a simple receiver that warned when radar emissions were present in the area, but it did not give direction or distance. It was more a vague alarm than a tool. Standing on Shiga's bridge, he was still fighting the kind of night actions he had trained for: visual, intuitive, based on horizon lines and the faintest hints of grey against black. The Americans waiting ahead were fighting a different kind of night. Shortly after 11:30 p.m., Takaro's column entered the broad waters of Vela Gulf. The wind had dropped. The sounds outside the bridge were muted: the hiss of water along the hull, the low rumble of machinery, the occasional quiet comment from a lookout. The destroyers held their formation, spaced at measured intervals, their navigation lights dark. The world beyond the ship's rail was a void. Takaro moved between the bridge windows, checking bearing and speed, confirming the position of the lead ship, then glancing aft to ensure the others followed as planned. He exchanged a few words with his executive officer, mostly confirming routine details. On the table behind them, a chart of the area showed their planned track toward Columbangra, a line passing carefully between reefs and islands. At almost the same moment, several miles away, an American destroyer division was scanning the same waters, through radar. Inside a dimly lit compartment aboard one of those ships, a radar operator watched as the sweep of the SG display completed another circle. A cluster of small echoes had appeared near the edge of the scope, moving steadily. With each rotation, their position shifted slightly. The operator called out range and bearing. Nearby, an officer took notes, comparing the radar plot to the chart on the table. Within minutes, the American commander had a clear sense of what was approaching. Multiple contacts in line ahead, likely destroyers traveling at high speed. Their course pointed almost directly into the Gulf. Their speed and spacing matched the pattern of previous Tokyo Express runs. While Takaro saw only dark water, his formation was now clearly visible to opponents who had not yet revealed themselves. On Shiga, a faint crackle sounded from the primitive radar warning receiver, indicating the presence of radio waves somewhere in the vicinity. The petty officer monitoring it glanced at his instrument, then reported the reading. Takaro listened, nodded once, and then returned his attention to the sea. Experience had taught him to be cautious with such devices. They often produced alerts with no visible source. The equipment was sensitive to various emissions, some of them distant, some reflected. Without information on direction, the signal was of limited tactical value. He had been trained to prioritize what his own eyes and his lookouts could confirm. Minutes ticked by. Takaro's binoculars swept the horizon. Nothing. On the American ship, by contrast, the picture grew clearer with each radar sweep. The destroyer division began a carefully calculated change of course, moving to a position from which they could launch an organized torpedo attack. Engines adjusted, rudders turned, and the American ship slid into a track designed to intersect the Japanese formation at an angle chosen for maximum effect. The two groups of ships were moving through the same body of water, but their understanding of that space was very different. For one side, the Gulf was still a mostly blank canvas. For the other, it had become a plotted map of targets, ranges, and possible firing solutions. Takaro could not know it, but the balance of information in this quiet night had already shifted. The first sign that something was truly wrong did not come in the form of a radar signal or a radio transmission. It came as a sudden, blinding flash far ahead and to starboard. One moment, the dark horizon was unbroken. The next, a brilliant orange-white burst lit up the sea, followed by a short, delayed rumble that rolled across the water. Takaro instinctively turned his head toward the light, binoculars already rising to his eyes. For a few seconds, the night lost its grip on the scene. The shape of a ship emerged in harsh contrast. It was Hagake's, the lead destroyer in the column. Where her bow had been moments before, a bright, expanding glow now dominated the view. Secondary flashes followed as stores and fuel ignited. The ship's forward section seemed to sag unnaturally. From Shiga's bridge, it was difficult to make out details at that distance, but it was immediately clear that something had struck hard and suddenly. Takaro's thoughts raced. Astray mine? An accident in the forward magazines? Some hidden reef? None of those explanations fully fit the violence of the initial burst. He swept his binoculars beyond the burning shape, searching for silhouettes against the glow. If enemy ships had fired, their guns might still be visible in the distance. Yet he saw only darkness beyond the light of the stricken destroyer.
No musle flashes.
No obvious outlines of opposing vessels. The sea seemed empty in every direction but the one now dominated by flame. He gave orders quickly. Lookouts were to check all sectors. Communications teams were to confirm signals with the other ships. The engine room was instructed to be ready for rapid maneuvering. On the chart, officers marked the approximate location of the blast and adjusted the formation's reference points. A few minutes later, another disturbance shook the night. This time, the target was Arashi, following behind Hagake's. Observers on Shiga reported multiple impacts in quick succession. From their vantage point, they saw the destroyer begin to list as bright flashes flickered along her hull. The water around her boiled with disturbed seas. Her course faltered. Takaro ordered illumination rounds prepared. To fight in darkness, Japanese crews often relied on their own starshells, bright flares fired high into the sky to reveal enemy positions. If the Americans were out there, perhaps hidden by distance or clever positioning, those artificial stars might show them. A moment later, shells arced upward, then burst overhead, turning portions of the Gulf into a ghostly daylight. The drifting light revealed churning water, fragments, struggling figures near the damaged ships. It showed the outlines of the Japanese vessels themselves more clearly. But where Takaro needed to see the enemy, there was nothing. The illuminated water beyond the ruined shapes was empty. No cruisers bearing down. No destroyer silhouettes on opposite courses. The sky above them was clear. The light floated, then dimmed, then faded, leaving only the continuing glow of burning fuel and the darker patches where ships no longer held their proper form. In those minutes, for the Japanese crews, the sense of fighting a known opponent shifted into something more unsettling. They were being struck, but the source remained invisible. The sea, which they had treated as familiar territory at night, now felt like it held something hidden just beyond the reach of their senses. Without realizing it, Takaro was experiencing what it meant to fight someone who could see him clearly while remaining unseen in return. The instinct to help is strong at sea, even in the middle of confusion. As Arashi slowed and struggled, Kawakaze altered course to close the distance. From Shiga's bridge, Takaro could see her turn slightly out of line, moving toward the area where figures were visible in the water. Some of those figures were waving weak lights. Others clung to floating debris. The illumination shells still cast an uneven glow over the scene. For a moment, Takaro faced a decision. On one side lay the duty to protect his own ship and the troops aboard. On the other lay the expectation, deeply held in his service, that no comrade was left without assistance if there was any chance to help. Kawakaze's captain had chosen to move in. Takaro chose a different path. He ordered Shiga to begin a turn intended to widen the distance from the area of the attacks. Engines increased to bring the ship up to higher speed. The helmsman repeated the order, and the destroyer leaned slightly as it responded. Before that maneuver could fully develop, another disturbance erupted near the rescue attempt. Observers on Shiga reported bright flashes along Kawakaze's midsection. The ship's hull seemed to buckle at a point where vital systems were concentrated. The glow from fires intensified, and her bow began to dip. Men on Shiga's bridge watched in strained silence as another vessel in their formation struggled to remain upright. By this stage, Takaro understood that remaining near the area was inviting the same treatment. Whatever was attacking them, torpedoes, most likely, was still active. The timing suggested a carefully planned pattern rather than random chance. Some opponent was launching accurate spreads into the paths of his ships. Yet even now, no one could point to a visible column of enemy vessels. He gave firm orders. Shiga would break away at high speed, using every bit of agility her design allowed. The crew responded quickly. Course changes were executed. The ship began a series of turns intended to make her a difficult target, zigzagging through the dark water. Speed climbed as the engine room pushed the machinery close to its limits. Around them, the night returned to being mostly unlit. The glow from the damaged and sinking ships gradually dimmed as distance increased. The sounds of chaos, shouts across the water, the crackle of small onboard explosions, the hiss of steam, faded into the general wash of the sea. On the chart table, officers tracked their own position as accurately as they could, marking bearings and times. The goal now was not to complete the transport mission. It was simply to exit the Gulf and reach more open water, where there might be room to maneuver and perhaps less danger from hidden threats. Takaro stood with his binoculars still in hand, though he lowered them more often now. At their new distance and speed, there was little to see but dark shapes of distant islands and the faint line where sky met sea. Each minute that passed without a new impact on his own hull felt like borrowed time. He had imagined many possible outcomes for a Tokyo Express run, arriving at the landing point to find unexpected opposition, engaging enemy destroyers in a brief but intense firefight, evading air attack on the way back at dawn. He had not imagined losing 3 ships in rapid succession without once glimpsing the enemy force responsible. That reality pressed on him as Shiga left the Gulf behind and headed towards safer waters. By the early hours of the morning, Shiga was alone, driving through the dark at sustained high speed. At last, with the outline of the Gulf behind them and no new signs of attack, Takaro ordered a reduction in speed. The engines eased down. The vibration underfoot diminished slightly. Some of the tension on the bridge relaxed, though it never fully disappeared. Officers and signalmen exchanged glances, each aware that something deeply troubling had just occurred. Reports from the other ships were sparse now. Many calls went unanswered. Occasional snippets of communication hinted at severe damage and rapid flooding on the vessels that had been hit. There were mentions of crews abandoning stations, of power failures, of fires that could not be controlled in time. Altogether, the situation pointed to a simple conclusion. Those ships were unlikely to return. Takaro began to compile his own account of the night, noting times, courses, and observed events. His entries were brief. There was little to add beyond what he had seen. There had been no sighting of enemy guns firing, no confirmed range to opposing hulls, no signals indicating the presence of a larger formation. There had been flashes, impacts, and the grim aftermath. The causes, from his immediate perspective, remained largely invisible. Upon reaching a safer anchorage hours later, Takaro handed in his initial report. Higher headquarters, already aware that ships were missing, called for a more detailed account. In the days that followed, he found himself sitting in rooms very different from his bridge, enclosed spaces with maps on the walls, officers asking calmly phrased questions, and intelligence specialists taking careful notes. They wanted to know everything. The exact sequence of the blasts, the behavior of the radar warning receiver, the bearing and appearance of any illumination shells, the state of the weather, any unusual sounds. Every small detail mattered. During these discussions, Takaro was presented with information of a different sort. Intelligence officers outlined what they believed had taken place from the American side. Based on intercepted communications and post-action reports obtained later, they described a destroyer task group equipped with advanced radar. These ships, they explained, had been tracking his formation well before the first explosion. On an American bridge, the scene had looked very different. Instead of searching the horizon with binoculars and scanning for silhouettes, their officers had watched radar screens on which 4 small marks moved steadily into range. Their plotted tracks showed course and speed clearly. The American commander had used that data to adjust his own formation's position, placing it so that a broad torpedo salvo would intersect the path of the Japanese destroyers at an optimum angle. When the time was right, American torpedo tubes had trained and fired, not in reaction to targets suddenly appearing out of the dark, but in execution of a plan made with the help of an instrument that could see far beyond the range of human vision at night. Takaro listened as technicians described the characteristics of this radar. It operated at shorter wavelengths than earlier sets, giving more precise readings. It rotated continuously, providing a full picture of the surrounding sea. Distances could be read with a margin of error far smaller than could be achieved by guessing based on visual observations alone. Bearing could be determined and updated quickly. His own ship's warning receiver, by contrast, could only indicate that such emissions were present somewhere nearby. It offered no guidance on where to turn or how far to be concerned. It had, in effect, told him there was something out there, but not what or where. The contrast was stark. One side had a tool that turned night into a navigable space filled with information. The other had tools and skills designed for a world in which everyone was equally blind after dark. In that room, with charts spread out and officers tracing imaginary ship tracks with their fingers, Takaro realized that what had happened at Vela Gulf was not simply a case of being outmaneuvered. It was an encounter between two different ways of understanding the same piece of ocean. The implications of that encounter did not take long to appear across the wider theater. In the weeks and months that followed, Allied destroyer groups equipped with effective radar sets began to apply similar tactics in other night actions. Where earlier engagements might have started with both sides stumbling upon each other in confusion, now American ships often entered battles with a reasonably clear idea of where their opponents were and how they were moving. At Empress Augusta Bay and in other actions around the Solomon Islands and beyond, patterns emerged that resembled what Takaro had experienced. Japanese formations steamed along in darkness, their commanders relying on trained eyes and well-practiced routines. At some point, radar-equipped American ships detected them at distances that would have been unthinkable for a lookout on a bridge wing. The Americans closed or shifted position based on this information, firing torpedoes or opening gunfire from advantageous angles. Japanese records from this period began to show a marked change. The confident tone that had characterized some earlier night battle reports softened as losses mounted in circumstances that were difficult to fully understand from the bridge of a ship without comparable sensors. Officers spoke of being engaged by an enemy they could not always locate quickly. They noted that incoming fire arrived from directions they had not expected. For units tasked with continuing the Tokyo Express runs, the environment became steadily more challenging. The routes were the same, the islands unchanged, but the invisible context had shifted. Where once the primary danger after dark had come from the possibility of colliding with surface opponents of similar capability, now there was an added layer, the risk of being plotted and intercepted by ships that could observe their movements long before the Japanese crews were aware of being watched. As the cumulative effect of these changes grew, Japanese command faced hard decisions. Continuing to send destroyers into confined waters heavily patrolled by radar-equipped opponents carried increasing risk for diminishing returns. Losing fast warships that were also needed for other duties could not be sustained indefinitely. Gradually, the rapid supply runs that had once defined the Tokyo Express declined. Some garrisons in forward positions received fewer shipments. Others were eventually evacuated. The web of bases and outposts that had seemed securely linked by determined night operations began to fray where it depended on routes now dominated by superior sensing technology. Among destroyer crews, the shift had a human cost that was not measured only in numbers of ships lost. Sailors and officers who had spent years mastering the fine points of night fighting based on visual cues now found themselves in repeated situations where those skills were not enough to counter an opponent's informational advantage. They trained their eyes to pick out distant shapes, their adversaries read their locations off screens. This was not to say that Japanese tactics and courage vanished. There were still sharp actions, still determined stands. But the balance of initiative tilted. In complex systems like naval warfare, such tilts accumulate. The events at Vela Gulf became one of several points historians later looked back on as marking a turning of the tide in how night battles at sea were decided. From his own perspective, Takaro felt this change in a more personal way. He had not commanded another Tokyo Express mission after that night. His ship survived, one of a relatively small number of destroyers to reach the end of the war still afloat. Yet the world in which he had trained to excel, the world where good optics, steady nerves, and careful judgment at night could overcome many other factors, had been altered in a way that could not be reversed simply by working harder or studying more. Years later, in a quieter time, Takaro spoke with researchers who were assembling detailed accounts of the Pacific Naval War. They met not on a swaying bridge but in modest offices, with notebooks and tape recorders in place of signal books and voice tubes. The questions were different, too. Instead of what is our course, or where is the enemy, the questions were what were you thinking, and how did it feel when you realized what had happened? Takaro did not dramatize his experiences. He described them plainly. He talked about the academy, about learning ship silhouettes as if they were characters in a script, about long evenings spent judging distance by how a grey shape dimmed against the horizon. He recalled the pride he and his peers had taken in mastering those skills. He spoke of the early night battles where those abilities had been decisive in gaining an advantage. When the discussion turned to Vela Gulf, his tone changed only slightly, but the shift was noticeable. He recounted how confident he had been at the start of that mission, based on routine and prior success. Then he described, in simple chronological order, the flashes in the night, the absence of visible attackers, the sense of trying to respond to blows without ever seeing the hand that delivered them. Ask how he interpreted those events once he learned more about the radar used against him. He paused before answering. We were not lacking as sailors, he said eventually. We were not lacking in commitment to our duty. We had trained for a certain kind of fight and became very capable in it. But in that Gulf, we met another way of fighting, one that had been prepared not just on ships and in classrooms, but in factories and laboratories. He went on to explain that, in his view, the most important factor was not just the existence of a single advanced device, but the system that had produced and deployed it. The American radar that had shown his formation so clearly on a scope was not a one-of-a-kind experiment. It was part of a larger pattern: industrial facilities capable of turning designs into large numbers of working sets, logistics networks able to deliver those sets to units across the ocean, training programs able to turn new recruits into competent operators quickly. In contrast, his own Navy had entered the war with excellent optical instruments and highly trained crews, but fewer resources available to match the rapid pace of technological change. Even had they obtained perfect knowledge of the enemy radar design midway through the conflict, replicating it in quantity and integrating it fleet-wide would have required time and industrial capacity they no longer possessed. For us, he summarized, night meant one thing. For them, by 1943, it meant something else. The researchers noted that line carefully. Looking back, it is easy to frame the story of that August night as simply a clash between radar and no radar. But the deeper lesson, reflected in Takaro's own reflections, lies in the broader idea of how information shapes combat. His years of training had reduced uncertainty in one domain, judging what could be seen with the eyes. The radar in the Gulf had reduced uncertainty in another, more far-reaching way, revealing what lay beyond the direct reach of human senses. The title one might give this story: Japanese destroyer captain faced American radar-guided night fighting, lost 4 ships in 90 minutes, captures the dramatic outline. It points to the compressed time frame and the imbalance in awareness that defined the engagement. Yet within that summary are embedded layers of preparation, doctrine, and industrial effort. On the surface, the events at Vela Gulf were about ships, torpedoes, and the harsh arithmetic of losses and survival. Just beneath, they were about how one side's ability to see had outpaced the others by a critical margin. Deeper still, they were about factories, research teams, and logistical chains that made those capabilities widely available. Takaro's final comment in one of his interviews returned to a simple image. We stood on our bridges and stared into the dark, he said. We trusted what we could see and what we had learned. They had screens that showed them more than the dark would ever reveal to us. That difference decided more than one battle. In that observation lies the quiet core of the story, not just the loss of ships in a short span of time, but the moment when a seasoned captain understood that the kind of night he had trained to master no longer existed in the same way for both sides.